our
on the record
presenters.
that Patrick was fashionably late for his day of presentation.
Yeah.
Well, at least I showed up.
At least. Well, that's a bare minimum.
Sorry, Captain.
Let's set the bar a little higher.
Is he still ill?
I don't know, to be honest.
Who's this?
Maybe he can't come here for 2 weeks.
I don't know.
Oh.
That's what I'm thinking.
No, but he was here for driving class yesterday.
Oh.
Huh.
I don't know that.
Maybe when Landon's going, I ain't coming for this.
I know Andrew is ill. I mentioned this before. I think that would be one reassuring echo of this global pandemic if people weren't to come to work sick and infect their coworkers and their peers and their teammates, and also I appreciate that. But let people know where you're going to be. Okay, we do have two presenters today. I don't want to take up too much of the time, but I just want to make some preliminary remarks here that reflect on these two pieces by Stan and by Beener here. Beginning with just some reflections on the politics of grievance, which is crucial in terms of the kinds of mobilization that we've seen associated with the so-called alt-right. And I think in part, and in reflecting on Grant and Muff here as well, there's some sense in which the idea of justice as fairness, ascertained on the basis of dispassionate reason, that idea of justice that we inherit from Kant, kind of misses the affective dimension of justice, which, everyone I think here has probably experienced injustice at some point in our lives. Yeah, hopefully not too much, but I think we're cued into that. And there's something especially powerful about that sense of having injustice done to you or to your own. Yeah, that has this emotional, affective dimension to it. It's not cold, dispassionate reason that's at play there. It's no, I or we have been wronged. And that's one strength, if you will, of the alt-right, has been to cue into that sense that some wrong has been done to us or to me. Yeah? And that's important because people who feel grievance in that affective way are more likely to mobilize politically. And we certainly saw that in the January 6th insurrection. The grievance there, of course, was that people thought that an election had been stolen from them. That Trump should have been president. Our man should have won. And they were out in the streets to protest on that basis. Do you have a hand going?
I was going to add something on if you
Sure,
don't mind.
please, yeah.
I think and Donald Trump and Republicans are driven, and the alt-right have been driven by grievance, but I think one of the, if not the most notable type of grievance that they've had taken issue with has been racial grievance over the past several years, and we see this in the European Union as well with Brexit, has been the idea that some other community is benefiting now, either because they've been given more access to certain rights or they have more opportunities. So we have to take back what is ours. It's a racial grievance, and it goes back to Black Lives Matter and George Floyd and all these events where they've really shown us that is their motive. It's more of a cultural, racial grievance than an economic or anything else like that.
Well, it could be an economic amplifier there too. Keep in mind, most of those Trump-like supporters are often former blue-collar workers that have lost employment
And
due
voted
to globalization.
Democratic for years.
In Rust Belt states.
I would push back on that. I do think there's an element, of course, in the United States and certainly in Britain of that. But I would say that if you look at if you actually read some of the documentation and look at documentaries about people going into the Rust Belt, going into in the UK, going into the northern region that voted predominantly for Brexit and votes predominantly Labour for years. The grievance is an economic one. There's a great documentary on The Guardian done by his name is, I think, is Owen Smith or Owen something, and he during a couple by-elections and during the 2019 okay, he actually went out there to speak to people, and they asked him, why have you changed your mind? Why aren't you voting for Labour? And it was the Brexit question, because, you know, for a long time we have seen a loss in our economy. You look at these streets and everything is boarded up, and their children are leaving because there's no jobs. And I think that would probably have a bigger impact than say a racial.
Yeah, they do though interconnect. You know, you can say I've lost my job, and look, it's these immigrants, it's these Polish workers coming in willing to work for less that are crowding me out of my employment.
Even if there isn't any Polish immigrant workers working in those regions at all, they predominantly go to the big cities where there are employment.
I mean, I think the problem is the fact that the government in some way, when the industry, the market shifted, there was no real hope for these people to come out of it. So they're kind of stuck in this loop. And it's half because the government wasn't supporting them, and half because they couldn't pick themselves up and gain new employment elsewhere. Because the age of factories is not coming back.
This is unlikely. Yeah, the idea that you resuscitate the United States as great industrial power is
Industrial might
unlikely.
come back, like in terms of like automation in America.
Mhm.
It won't be hiring as many workers as it did in the 60s.
Yeah, if it's driven by robots. So, in any case, the point here is that there's a politics of grievance that's at play in terms of mobilizing the base. I can't help myself, you know, thinking about Bannon. I was reading today Breitbart News and its commentary on the Arbery murder trial in Georgia. 3 white men charged with the murder of a black man, and you know, Breitbart is notorious for its race baiting. You know, it's all too willing to point to crimes and amplify crimes committed by immigrants, especially racialized immigrants, to sort of promote that trope, that narrative of an ethno-nationalism, you know, in terms of its hard right, explicitly fascist, I would say, and racist, clearly, motivations. And you know, the comment section was predictable. I cannot help myself but to go to the comment section. The story was rather brief, very short. They didn't amplify it very much because it wasn't the verdict that they wanted. But yeah, all kinds of horrendously disagreeable comments on the case, you know, suggesting there was an unjust outcome, and that, you know, the race of the man who was shot somehow indicated that they deserved it. Absolutely atrocious. But that's been a part of the play of Bannon, has been to touch on those hot button topics that get people hot under their collar. You know, they get people feeling aggrieved, feeling as if their place of privilege has been taken away from them. You know? And you know, Biener asked an interesting question here as to whether we could learn somehow from that tactic of mobilization, adopt this politics of grievance so as to contribute to an experiment in social democracy, as he calls it. You know, and I would point here to parallels between the alt-right's critique of what they call globalism and the alter globalization or the anti-globalization movement of the late 90s and the early 2000s. You have very similar kinds of grievances at play there. You know, initially, in terms of the forum focused protest that we saw there, you know, the battle in Seattle, protests against the WTO and this kind of thing, the narrative from the left was that globalization represents elite interests and it is against working class interests. There's you know, a sense of a loss of job security that goes hand in hand with the increase in the mobility of capital. I would say that's a pretty basic contradiction within the ideology of trade liberalization. You know, the argument from a strictly economic perspective for globalization is, well, if we make the factors of production more free, we'll realize greater efficiency in the production and distribution of goods, and we'll all become more wealthy as a result. The truth, and that may be true in a strictly theoretical economic sense, that there are these absolute and relative efficiencies of production, advantages of production, and so by removing barriers to trade and the flow of the factors of production, you inhibit the realization of those efficiencies. Fine, that's true. The problem, however, with that logic is that some of the factors of production are more able to move than others. Investment capital is freer to move than human capital. Why would that be? Why would investment capital be freer to move than human capital, workers? It's kind of an obvious point. Yeah, Patrick?
Investment capital is kind of an abstract. It's money, it's words, paper, whatever. I can send that across the world. I can just on my phone, I can send that, sell a stock on Wealth Simple, whatever I want to do. Whereas human capital, it's hard to move because you've got most humans have roots set down
Yeah.
where they are.
Yeah.
So it's very hard to ask a human to move to a new city, let alone a
Sorry,
new
that's me.
province or country or continent. So
Yeah. Those connections with place, family, friends, and then you have very real barriers to the movement of human capital. Finding, making it possible to work in another country is a very difficult process, and as you describe, investment capital, especially in terms of in these digital forms, can move very quickly and easily. So there's a fundamental imbalance at play there, and those anti-globalization movements cued upon that sort of theoretical gap within the neoliberal agenda. Yeah.
Can we argue that it's not really globalization that caused this inequality, but rather a failure of policymakers to keep up with the change? But
Perhaps. Yeah.
it's very easy, very tax-free, or very low tax to move capital across countries. If governments instead decided to cap that free flowing of goods and capitals and raise certain taxes, you could then argue that this would.
Yeah, but the concern, of course, was that if governments don't remove these barriers to trade, they'll be left out, and they won't attract the investment capital that they need to develop. But of course, the cost here is national autonomy, sovereignty, the ability to determine your own labor laws, for example, your own environmental laws. We see the softwood lumber dispute playing out again here as the Americans promised to up tariffs, I think 17%, something like that, because the arrangement, the stumpage fees that we pay here in Canada, a very different model, crown ownership of the resources, with those stumpage fees paid by companies. Arguably, that's not fair in relation to privately owned forests south of the border. Is Canada inhibited just in terms of how we look at our relations with the land? Do we need to privatize our forests? I'm sure that would be at odds with our sensibilities as Canadians in terms of how we see our relation with the forests and with the resources around us.
Just a
Yeah.
side note, there's
Yeah.
also conflict over whether the Crown should even have ownership of those resources, considering Indigenous people, have some of those.
Well, and then, if we were to open that question, Indigenous and Crown relations would have to be brought into it as well, clearly. Yeah, this is not something that a trade dispute mechanism can resolve. The people would have to have a say. And this was the critique of the anti-globalization or the alter-globalization movement, and in many ways it's the critique of the alt-right now, which is that globalization inhibits the self-determination and the sovereignty of peoples. Again, it represents elite interests that are disconnected from that ground of the political identity, and it's somehow imposed upon people. So just to say that there is some comparison to be drawn here between left-wing and right-wing critiques of globalization, but you don't hear as much from the left on that front presently. The right is the dominant voice there. In terms of the differences, though, I wouldn't want to overstate here the similarities, although in terms of those interests, there is overlap. There are some key distinguishing features of the alt-right in this regard. We have the associated critiques of multiculturalism and of immigration as somehow watering down a traditional demographic that somehow is identified with being American. We have ethno-nationalism associated with that. We have isolationism in terms of foreign policy going along with that as well. the America First motto. And this shades critiques of global capitalism and of elite interests and mainstream media, shades those critiques which have some place into anti-Semitic tropes. When you start to say that it's the international bankers, it's George Soros and his AstroTurf protests, or his imposition of Western values in Hungary, as we were discussing earlier, or it's Hollywood and the media that are twisting the narrative here, those shade quite easily into traditional anti-Semitic tropes. And that's a distinguishing feature, arguably, of the far right here. Beyond the politics of grievance, I think one other aspect of what's being described in these two pieces that jumps out to me is this notion of politics as entertainment. The Trump presidency was certainly an entertaining moment. Now, whether comedy or tragedy, maybe reality always has both of those dimensions at play. Do we laugh or do we cry? Well, take your pick, depending upon the daily news. This idea of politics as entertainment demonstrates core affinities with fascism. So, to focus on the appearance of things rather than to have those sort of boring, policy wonkish discussions that we would traditionally associate with politics, and with political science. Fascism cues into this focus on appearances. Front and center here, of course, is the charismatic leader and the cult of personality associated with that charismatic leader, with a focus there on the appearance and the affectations of the dear leader, the hand gestures, the look of him, all these things. Hitler, too, was noted for practicing his gestures before a mirror to kind of dial in that aesthetic that he was looking for there. I can't think of a politician more attuned to his own image than Trump was. More obsessive over how he was represented in the media than that particular individual. In terms of how that image is cultivated, again here, unlike a traditional politician who would focus on policy, say, who would present themselves in a very flat sort of manner to seem respectable, to seem like a sort of the kind of measured individual, the steady hand that you'd want on the tiller of the state. Here, instead, the emphasis is on authenticity. Do you present yourself in a real and familiar and approachable way? Trump, on a couple of occasions, kind of made an act of talking like a real politician was expected to act, and of course, he presented himself in a vulgar way, seemingly incapable of speaking in complete sentences, but not caring because this somehow addressed him to the people in a way that they could relate. There's an emphasis on authenticity and on resolve. So in the absence of being able to give a reason why you're doing what you're doing, why is this policy rational? Tell me. If we're not going to have that discussion, what we have instead is, as Heidegger says, a decision to decide, a call to conscience, where the power of the decision is in its resolution, not in any rational basis behind it. It is, therefore, the sovereignty of the state is located in the decision of the dear leader themselves. And as we know, only I can save us becomes then the mantra, setting the policymakers aside in favor of this dear leader. So there's an aestheticization of political leadership, and there's also an aestheticization of the crowd as well. Has everyone seen Triumph of the Will? Leni Riefenstahl's?
Yeah, we watched that comparative politics of the media.
Oh, you did? Wonderful. The whole thing?
I think we watched part of it.
No, we watched the whole thing and then.
The whole hour.
Okay, yeah. Beautiful. Riefenstahl. She was the first to move the camera. I don't know if you know. First to start moving the camera. And that, the Nuremberg rallies there were made for TV. The crowds were arranged in such a way that they would present well on film. And she was given unlimited access to shape not only her participation, but the set itself, if you will, where the movement of the crowd becomes the purpose. Yeah? Recall for Trump how important it was for him, the numbers at his inauguration. Yeah? The size of the crowd. It's partly a matter of ego, but this is an expression of, again, politics is entertainment. How big a crowd did I get out? Now, that's the point. And it's not ephemeral to it. That is the substance of it. And the desire then is not just to assemble a large crowd, but to have a kind of emotional play between. Yeah? If you watch the faces of those in those Nuremberg rallies in Triumph of the Will, there is a genuine kind of ecstatic revelry. We often imagine Nazism as an imposition onto the will of the people. At least as they're represented there, those people are enthusiastic about this movement that they're participating in. Yeah? It's not the state imposing itself. Recall how the film begins with a kind of summer camp setting, yeah? Where they're engaged in calisthenics together, they're eating together, they're cooking together. There's a sense of being a part of something, that they're in on something. There's an authentic social movement at play. And certainly the dear leader is important as a focal point, but the crowd is important as well. The aestheticization of movement, especially in totalitarian regimes, becomes a fixture. We see this in North Korea, for example, especially, yeah? In these coordinated, choreographed crowd movements. And with this rhetorical sophistry for the purposes of nothing other than an emotional response. That is the point of fascistic leadership. Yeah.
I remember some of his speeches sounding really like liberal language.
Who?
Hitler.
Oh, okay.
His speeches were like a lot of like how he gathered everybody and how he like his words. Like I remember the words that he was saying in his speeches. I was like, that's like it's like in some liberal speeches today.
Liberal?
Like
What do you mean by
just,
liberal?
Like, working together and stuff, and for
Well,
peace and for like.
Yeah. I don't know. It's decidedly illiberal because there's an identity between the group and the leader. He becomes an expression of the spirit of the Volk, but there's no individual left. There's no possibility in a Hitler speech or in a Trump speech to stand back and say, can I ask a question about that particular policy? Hitler says, I am the people. He is an expression of the will of the people. So there's a kind of a union, a gathering together of the people in that ecstatic, emotional moment. Yeah? And this is very much an argument contra liberalism. It's against the progressive cosmopolitan agenda, which supposedly levels individual and national virtue and greatness, which liberalism levels patriarchal dominance and manly virtues. Alex Jones, another one of these indicted individuals there, making the argument that somehow, what was it, that fluoride in the drinking water turns frogs.
Turn the frickin' frog skate.
Yeah.
Well, no, here's the best part. If you keep watching the video, he starts like, I need to get strong on my anger issues. But luckily, I can handle my anger issues with these pills.
But the expression of anger, much less in Hitler, that's an expression of his manly virtue. Yeah? And so he's respected precisely because he gets angry at things that other people let pass due to political correctness. Yeah? And this is a trope within fascism, the restoration of patriarchy. In terms of who is the dear leader, the dear leader is the patriarch, the tough guy, the killer, as Bannon describes both himself and Trump. And fascism is against liberalism in that liberalism and the separation of church and state bring Judeo-Christian and Western values on par with all others and suppress the sense of the superiority of our way of doing things vis-a-vis the others, inducing a relativism that inhibits action and absolving that friend-enemy distinction while exhibiting weakness in the face of hatred. And then finally, fascism of this variety is against globalism. one of the curious things about Bannon's efforts here is they attempt to bring far right-wing governments together when
That's so bizarre.
it is kind of bizarre when they're
So
percent.
bizarre.
The,
Like in the European Parliament,
yeah.
like you're going to bring a bunch of nationalist groups together from different countries to
And you're shocked
do
when it
what?
doesn't work.
But he feels like he's on the right side of history, that there's an historical moment, really the ideologue in that, and that we can tear down liberal democracy, tear down the state now, and that this will be the sweeping wave of far-right governments that will replace.
And I think people working together. I think fascist Germany and Lenin's ground. And I think people working together.
Yeah, no, that's not a political program that's easy to get on side with, if you're a neighbor, especially. Yeah. And so just contra globalism here, we have, of course, again, that America First motto. We have the Muslim ban. We have the border wall at the southern border of the United States, with a brief contemplation of a border wall with Canada as well early on in the presidency, although yeah, if you can't build that one, it's going to be hard to build this one further north. And, you know, a move away from multiculturalism and immigration presented somehow as global conspiracies to weaken the West or to, you know, aid the prospects of Democrats in terms of their chances of election. So these are, I would say, the fascistic tropes that come up in these contemporary formations. And all I would ask, and I'll turn things over to the presenters here now, but all I would ask here is whether we can, within the liberal tradition, recover some sense of shared purpose and of higher calling within that tradition. I think there is something that is missing here. And this came up in terms of the encounter with Islamic fundamentalism, and I think it comes up in this encounter with the domestic terror threat from the far right. If we can answer that question of who are we and what are we for, in many ways we take the oxygen out of their argument, because it seems premised on this idea that there's something great about our identity. There's something distinctive and unique about who we are, and these foreign interminglings are diminishing that, leveling that in some fashion. Can we restore a sense of purpose and shared values within liberal traditions, broadly understood, small L liberal, so as to answer those critiques that there's something inherently leveling or relativistic about the West and about liberalism as such? I would leave it there. So maybe we should move on to the present, unless there are any questions here. I want to make sure we have enough time for the two presenters today. Landon, Patrick, which of you wanted to go first?
I can go first if you want.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay.
Yeah, so if you guys have any questions or comments, just jump in,
Sure.
because I'm a rambler. All right, so, well, I'm drinking.
He said ask any questions.
Pertinent questions here. Anyway, all right. So when it comes to discussing modern politics, I believe it is inevitable that the conversation will fall upon the phenomenon known as the election of President Donald Trump. Trump, a thrice married New York businessman, took the Republican Party by storm, reshaping its ideology during his 4 years in the White House. As a conservative, who views American conservatives like William F. Buckley Jr. and Barry Goldwater as heroes, I